Harriet Tubman's parents. Who are Harriet Tubman's parents? Who were they, and what can we know about the woman behind the legend, right? Because every time we look at something and we see something grow, something magnificent, a magnificent fruit, there's always a root, right? There are a lot of places that have, history is a part of them. And I got a chance to ride around and to visit some of the places where Harriet Tubman grew up on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. And it's just amazing when you think about all the history that took place there. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to show you some pictures, and I'm going to show you some information from my book, They Can't Pull Us Up, Harriet Tubman and Her Life. That is a book that's available on Amazon. And I thank you so much for those who are supporting me and buying some books on Amazon or becoming members here on YouTube. Just $4.99 a month at a regular membership level, or $8 or $9.99 a month for an ancestor level. So I very much appreciate it. There you get offered. I offer library of information around Kemetic and Kushite history, as well as African American history, as well as some online courses and timelines. So I'm building together a library of resources that you can study from. So I'll also be launching additional online courses very soon where you can study about this and learn about this yourself. So I appreciate you checking out They Can't Pull Us Up, Harriet Tubman and Her Life. And let's kind of just jump into it. Let's talk about it a little bit, because as I think about it, and I thank you so much for your support, as I think about this, I want to talk about Harriet Tubman and her life, and I want to talk about her parents, right? Because as we think about a lot of the things from a Kushite and a Kemetic perspective. We talked a lot about, about heroes and Haru, and about the idea of Asar, and about the idea of Tahuti, and manifesting God inside of you. And we look a lot of times through the amazing things that our ancestors did way in the past. I mean, we know that there are people in our more recent past, if you will, who did amazing things. And when I think about Harriet Tubman, I think about Tahuti. I think about the guidance she had as she was navigating those places on the eastern shore in the Chesapeake Bay, how she followed God's guidance, whether it was to go south instead of north to get the people off her trail, to go across the stream, and she didn't know how deep it was in the cold weather to get to the other side because people were chasing her. Various things she did. I believe she listened to her spirit. And when you think about it, you look at her, you find that the people who gave birth to her parents were also remarkable people. She got her vision, if you will, and her inspiration a lot from her family. So I just want to delve into that a little bit and talk a little bit about her and her family. As I mentioned, I'm coming from my book, Harriet Tubman, They Can't Pull Us Up. It's about her life. So They Can't Pull Us Up. It's about Harriet Tubman, Her Life, and it's a book that I have this on Amazon. And I thank you so much for joining me. God bless you. So I kind of want to jump into it. Thank you so much for joining. Kind of want to jump into it as we think about that, and we kind of jump into the book. She was born, as I mentioned, on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay, and we'll get kind of a little bit of a geography of that. And as I got there, and the pictures that I'm showing you, a lot of the pictures here are pictures that I took myself, so I got a chance to look at that. And you look at this, one of the places. And this is a blue heron, which you'll find a lot in the state of Maryland. This is a blue heron. When you look at this, you find a lot about this. This kind of reminds me of Tahuti. When I think about Harriet Tubman, and I think about the ibis and how many, many ibises were basically embalmed and mummified, if you will, in ancient Kemet and used as a symbol of Tahuti. I look about it and I think about this bird that I saw when I was near the Chesapeake Bay, and how that kind of interacted and just reminded me of the idea of Tahuti and Asar and Haru and various things being active in Harriet Tubman's life. So as we think about, just to give you an idea where she was born, as I mentioned, she's born in Maryland on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. Very interesting, just to give you some background, because to understand her parents and to understand kind of what her motivations were and some of the things we're going to touch on today, it's kind of good to understand some background around it. So this is the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay right here. Talbot County, Maryland, just by chance, if you will, it so happens is where Frederick Douglass was born. He was born about 30 miles north of where Harriet Tubman was born. She was born in Dorchester County, Maryland. So she's right there around Cambridge, Maryland, Dorchester County, Maryland. And she did a lot of her travels right up and down the Choptank River, which you can see kind of flows north. So there were many times where she was following the Choptank River up through Talbot County, Caroline County, and going into Delaware and going further north into Philadelphia. And her father and mother lived right around here. And, there's a lot that we don't know about Harriet Tubman. There's some things that we do know about her. We believe her grandmother, her mother's side, may have come from Africa and been kidnapped and brought here. But we do know that probably she came into this port right here around in Dorchester County, to a port that was there in Cambridge, Maryland. That's probably where her family may have come in terms when part of them were kidnapped from Africa. But we think about it, as we look at this whole area is just teeming with life. When you think about it, it's the eastern shore, it's the Chesapeake Bay. There are many, many things taking place in this right around many, many waterways, many, many rivers. And when you think about that, you start to understand the kind of backbreaking work that people did. So Harriet Tubman's mother and father, their name were Ben Ross and Harriet Ross. So as I kind of look at that, just to give you a perspective of it, So you'll get an idea. Ben and Rit, right? So Ben Ross was owned by a man named Anthony Thompson, and Rit was owned by a separate person. So what you have is a situation where whereas Harriet, who is Harriet Tubman's mother, Rit was short for Harriet, and Ben Ross was her father. And they essentially met because their owners married each other. There was a woman who had inherited Harriet, or Rit Green, if you will. Her last name was Green. Harriet Green was Harriet Tubman's mother. Her last name was Green, Harriet Green, and her father's name was Ben Ross. So that was Harriet Tubman's mother and father, Ben Ross and Harriet Green, and Rit was short for Harriet. And as we think about that, they would go on to have some 9 children together. They had 9 children as a part of just their union. And it's interesting because Ben Ross himself was a fighter. Ben Ross was somebody who worked in the timber, and this whole area up and down Maryland and the Eastern Shore, as they began to, as you probably know, in the early part of the colonies in America, they began to grow tobacco and all kinds of things that just destroyed the soil and destroyed the usefulness and the nutrients that were in the soil. They had to turn to other things. And you found an area where they were using and working with all types of timber and all types of things just to be able to find ways to make money. And so enslaved people at the time when Harriet Tubman was born in Maryland, they were not just growing tobacco, because that had already been done for a while and basically destroyed the nutrients in the soil. They turned to other things, and one of the things was timber. And Ben Ross was apparently an excellent man, an excellent organizer. And he was enslaved by a man who was doing timber as well as other things, right? And he ended up at some point in time working his way free. He ended up becoming free, and probably around 1840 or 1840s or thereabout, he was able to work his way to freedom. Now, his wife, Rit Green, or Harriet Green, she was supposed to be free. She was owned by a man, Matthew Patterson, and he left her and her children, of which Harriet Tubman would have been one, to his granddaughter, which is just crazy to leave people to your grandchildren, right? And he put a provision in his will that all of her children, her and her children, would be let free at a certain age. So she was supposed to be set free by a certain age. Well, that never happened. And it turns out that Harriet Green, Rick Green's owner, whose name was Mary, married the owner of Ben Ross, and that's how they met each other. And because eventually she had a son, and it was believed that her son would inherit the children of Rit Green. For that reason, Ben and Rit got a chance really to spend time together and not be sold and separated, because they were waiting for Mary's son, Edward Brodus, to grow up and receive his inheritance that really wasn't legally his, but receive his inheritance, which would have been all of their children. So when you think about this kind of gives you just some background with respect to how they met and why they had some time together. And so you end up with a situation where Ben and Rit are on the same plantation, being enslaved by a husband and wife who were widows of themselves on their second marriage, if you will. At least the lady was on their second marriage, and waiting for her son to grow up to take on his inheritance, which would have been these people. And that gave them time to basically have children. And I want to kind of give you the names of the children of Ben and Rit. So these are Harriet Tubman's father and mother, Ben Ross, and Rit Green. And they had 9 children, and Harriet was one of them. So I just want to go through the names, because a lot of times we talk about it and we don't know some of the sad stories, because a lot of the reasons why Harriet Tubman did what she did was to kind of come back and save her family. She wanted to save her family, and some of her sisters, especially the older ones, were already sold, and she was not able to save them. She was able to save brothers, but not able to save all of her sisters. So it's important to mention their names, right? And to remember them. So Lena was the firstborn. Lena was probably born around approximately 1808. And as I mentioned, this is coming from my book. They can't pull us up, Harriet Tubman Life. This is coming from my book. So Lena was born in approximately 1808. Then Mariah in 1811. Soph in 1813, Robert in 1815, and Harriet's name was Araminta, and they called her Minty. And she was kind of, a short lady. She ended up being about 5 feet tall when she was full grown. So she was kind of small, and she went through a lot of things, in her life, being hit upside the head with the weight and all types of things. But when she was born, they called her Minty. Her name was Araminta, but she was called Minty by her family. Now, when she got older, she adopted the name of Harriet, and probably after her mother. Her mother was named Harriet. Rit was short for Harriet. She probably took on her mother's name, and when she got married, her husband's name was John Tubman. So you end up finding her, being known by the name of Harriet Tubman, even though her family called her Minty. She was born probably in 1822 or thereabouts on the farm, on the place where their father was enslaved, and they were waiting for the inheritance of the mother's side to take on his inheritance, if you will. So she was born there, more than likely. And then her younger brother was Ben, named after the dad. He was born in 1823, Rachel in approximately 1825, Henry in about 1829 or 1830, and finally Moses in 1832. So these are Harriet Tubman's brothers and sisters. And Ben and Rit had, as I mentioned, 9 children. They had 9 children. And these were, amazing things. These were people who were trying to raise their children like anybody else would, and they would end up having remarkable children and a remarkable child that would go down in history. So Ben was a freedom fighter. Rit was someone who did as much as she could to take care of her family and to take care of her children. She did as much as she could, and there were times when eventually, when the person who inherited them got older, he took them away. He took them to a farm. This farm that you see in the background where a plaque is up. He took them away to a farm, and he ends up basically using her children to hire out to give to people. And it's Edward Brodus. The man's name is Edward Brodus. He's the one who inherited Rit and all of her children, take them about 9 miles away from where their father was enslaved, and basically hire them out and use them as enslaved people. He was not a very rich person, and he did not do a very good job of managing his money. He didn't do a very good job of managing his money or managing a lot of things, and he ended up dying in debt. And it's interesting because at some point in time, according to the original will that left Harriet Tubman's mother to somebody's family, somebody's grandchildren, she was supposed to be set free at the age of 45, and her children were supposed to be set free at a particular time. But this man, Edward Brodus, who inherited Harriet's mother, never adhered to that. Nobody ever put that through. Nobody ever paid any attention to that. A lot of people, obviously African Americans didn't have rights. Nobody was respecting the rights of Harriet Green and her family, and you end up having them being enslaved. And he eventually sells off some of Harriet's brothers and some of her sisters. He sells them off, and he goes to, continues to go on and about his own life, and he begins to kind of move forward with that. So he begins to sell them off and to make money from them. And at times, there were times when Harriet did not see parts of her family. She did not see her sister after her sister was sold off to probably south, maybe to Georgia and places like that, because that was the word. They were sold south into Georgia. So you find Ben and Rit being a husband and wife, and being kind of in terror, being in a situation where they can't take care of their children, being in a situation where their children are being sold away, and they have no recourse to be able to help them be free. And you feel for that, and you see that, and you start to find why Harriet Tubman was so significant and so bent on really making sure that when she finally became free herself, when she finally was able to escape, and at first she was going to escape with her brothers and they wanted to come back, and she came back with them, and then she ended up going on her own. The very first thing she said is she came to a solemn resolution. She came to a resolution that she felt like the whole world was just shining with freedom, but that she was like almost like a person who had gotten out of prison, and there was nobody there to share that joy with. She wanted to go back and get her family. There was a solemn resolution that she had in her heart that I was free and they should be free also. She said that was her motivation. That was her motivation for going back and helping to free her nieces, and to free her niece's husband, and to help to free her brothers, and to free countless other people, going back time and time, 10, 11, 12, 13 times, and doing even more than that in the Civil War, because she believed other people had a right to feel that freedom. And when you think about it, at the root of that was a lot of the love and the protection she had from her dad. And this particular scene is a scene right from near where she was enslaved when she was a child. But a lot of the love and the protection and the respect she had, she wasn't just the only one fighting. Her dad was also fighting. And there's some remarkable stories of her dad just kind of working through and being the one to move through, because as she moved through and left her places of enslavement and came back to save people, this was a whole difficult place to go. I mean, if you're running, a lot of people are running with no shoes on, they're running with just the clothes on their back. There's a lot of things you have to navigate in this area. And as we do that and we think about that, just to show you a couple things, there's a very famous thing that you hear. I just want to kind of mention it to you. You hear a lot of people talk about that in the area they could see like the moss growing on one side of the tree, and you could tell where north was by reading the stars in the sky as well as looking at tree. This is an example of a tree from Talbot County, Maryland. You can see that on one side of the tree, given the angle of the sun, you can clearly see what's green and what's not green, right? You could literally find your way north by reading the signs and the trees and the leaves and following the river, the Choptank River, and being able to know where the North Star was, as well as being able to see the moss on which side of the tree, which pointed north, given the angle of the sun. So there were a lot of things that she was doing and that people were doing to help one another navigate this area. And there's a really strong impact that her dad had. Her dad wasn't just somebody who was standing on the side, just doing nothing. Her dad was somebody who was really working and really kind of working to make things kind of work out. He was somebody who was fighting, and this was kind of near where his home would have been. He was somebody who himself was helping people on the Underground Railroad. And there is a famous story of the people called the Dover Eight. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but this is about the Dover Eight. These were people who were enslaved in the area where Harriet Tubman was. They were enslaved, and there were eight of them. They were men and women, and they were escaping. Harriet Tubman not only went back and helped to save people herself and personally escorted them in this treacherous area, but in this not easy to navigate area, but she also would send messages. So if she didn't go back directly herself, she would send messages to people to give them ways, give them people to talk to, say, get to this point and talk to this person or talk to this man, and they will help you. So she would send messages to help other people navigate. And so one of the messages she sent was for people that were called the Dover Eight. They would come to be called the Dover Eight. And they were people who were leaving from the Maryland Eastern Shore, and they were following the instructions that Harriet Tubman gave them in order to get out of this area. And what was interesting about it, some of the people that Harriet Tubman worked apparently may have been her family members. One would have been her father, Ben Ross. He was also helping people apparently to escape, even his own sons when she finally came back to get them, as well as a man named Samuel Green, who we'll talk about, who might have been related to Harriet's mother, Rick Green. So obviously Harriet would have had family, right? So Rick probably wasn't her only child. If we think that Harriet Tubman's grandmother was there and was enslaved there, she probably had more than one child. There were family members. And she also had, 8 brothers and sisters. There were 9 of them. So she had family in this area. And some of the people who might have been related to her mother might have been free or at one point enslaved, and it worked their way to freedom. So Harriet Tubman knew a lot of people. She was somebody who was networked and connected and who could work these things, not only navigating it, know how to do it herself, but also working with people like her father and maybe family members like Samuel Green to help get messages to people to get them out. So this group of 8 people who were following Harriet Tubman's instructions, they were being helped maybe by Samuel Green and her father. They went up north, like we talked about, follow that whole Choptank River into Delaware. When they got into Delaware, they met a man named Thomas Otwell. And Thomas Otwell was an African-American man, a man who Harriet Tubman knew. And Harriet Tubman had given him instructions to help these people. And as you know, they're supposed to be helping you. God bless you. Thank you so much. So God bless you. Just thank you for joining. I very much appreciate it, and for your comments. Thank you so much. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's a wonderful topic to talk about as we kind of talk about it. So as she had, thank you so much. So as she is giving them instructions, they get to Delaware. They meet Thomas Otwell. He's a black man who was instructed to meet them. Harriet Tubman has sent him the message, hey, you're going to have people coming, and here's what the deal is. And so they had people on the trail. They had people hot on the trail, and there was obviously an award put out for them, a reward for their capture. And these people were, as I mentioned, 8 of them, they're from the same area of Maryland as Harriet Tubman was, and they're trying to fight for their freedom. Now, because there was a pretty hefty price on their head, if you will, some people traded him. So this man, Thomas Otwell, ends up, instead of kind of following Harriet Tubman's advice, and he had worked with Harriet Tubman. She had worked with him on several occasions where, he helped to get her from place to place. It's important to note that on the Underground Railroad, people were not just doing things just to do them. They were risking their lives to help. So a lot of times you had to pay them. Many times Harriet Tubman would go to Philadelphia and work as a maid, and then she would come back and save up money and use that for her trips to go help save people, because she knew she'd have to get clothes or she'd have to pay somebody to help them. People weren't just going to do it for free. So this man, Thomas Otwell, he decides, instead of helping these people who Harriet Tubman was giving instructions to and trying to help, instead of helping them, he leads them to a place at night, a building, kind of a brick building, a 2 or 3 story building. He leads them, and it turns out this is the sheriff's house. He leads them basically to the jail. And they weren't exactly sure where they were. They were scared. They weren't exactly sure where they were. And as they opened up, they were like, it's kind of a cold night. Are we going in here? And they were like, he said, well, don't worry, you'll be warm soon. And as he led them and they opened the door and they went up the steps, the police jump out and the sheriff jumps out. And so this man basically betrayed them. He took them all the way to Delaware, to the sheriff's place, to the jail, to the area jail. And the authorities tried to capture them. When the authorities tried to capture them, these people just fought. The men and the women fought. And they were on the top level and they went down one flight to where basically the sheriff's personal living quarters were. And they ended up fighting and bursting into the door where his family was asleep and his wife was asleep. And they're fighting. They're fighting for their lives. And then one of the men who was in this group of Dover 8, and this is kind of important because it's connected, he takes the anvil that's in the fireplace, he takes her with that big heavy iron thing, and he spreads fire. He starts to spread fire around the room to cause a panic. And then they take and they break out the window, and the women jump first. They jump at least 12 feet or more down to the bottom. They jump first. And when they get down to the bottom, there's another fence up there. And they have to jump over the fence to get out. So he's fighting, and the people are fighting. The women jump out, the men jump out, and he finally gets out. And the last man to get out, he gets out, he sees the fence, he jumps over the fence, and there's the sheriff by this time waiting for him in his stockings with a gun pointed directly at him. And the sheriff takes the gun, points it at the man as he's about to leave, and pulls the trigger, but the gun doesn't go off. And so the last man that's a part of this Dover 8 gets to run away. 6 of them make it all the way to Canada, continually following the advice that Harriet Tubman had gotten through secret ways. And the other 2, we don't know what happened to them. And once they got to Canada, we're not sure. The reason why this story is important and how it connects to Harriet Tubman's family and to her friends, this gentleman right here is Samuel Green. This is one of the pictures of Samuel Green. And he might have been, as I mentioned, Harriet Tubman's mother's cousin. He may have been related to Harriet Tubman. They had the same last name. He may have been related. And she probably had family all up and down this area. He was somebody who was suspected of helping the Dover 8. And more than likely, Harriet Tubman, and she did at times, more than likely Harriet Tubman had given him instructions that she sent to him in various ways. And one time she had a letter sent to him to tell him to tell her brothers to be on the lookout, because, well, to one, not him, to somebody else. So to tell her brothers to be on the lookout because she was coming to get them. She would send letters back to people and have other people write them and put encoded things in the letters in order for them to know what was going to take place. Or she would send other ways to get messages to people. So he was believed to have been someone who was helping the Dover 8. And he ends up being arrested. And so this is probably more than likely Harriet Tubman's family member and cousin. He gets arrested, and they can't really find any evidence of him actually helping the people. The whole idea of the Dover 8 and how they escaped, and people wanted to know who was helping them and what was the network. They never really obviously caught on to Harriet Tubman, never caught her, and never figured out that it was her who was sending a lot of messages, as well as other people as a part of a network, as well as her father. But they couldn't pin everything on him. They didn't find enough information to actually convict him. So they actually charged him with holding a piece of literature that was designed to kind of, inspire insurrection. He had Uncle Tom's Cabin. He had Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin in his home. The police found that, the authorities found that, and they charged him. And he might be the only person in American history to go to jail for having a book. He literally went to jail and was sentenced, I think, to 10 years in prison until part of that sentence was commuted for having Uncle Tom's Cabin, because they thought he was helping people out, and he was, but they couldn't pin it on him. And so at this time, when this happened in the 1850s, around 1857 or thereabout, this was a big thing. And this was, Harriet Tubman's, probably her family member, being convicted. She was concerned that her dad was also going to be put in prison. She was concerned that they were going to come after her dad next. And apparently her dad was the kind of man who was also helping, who was maybe a part of her network, who was somebody who we know helped his sons escape when she came to get them. He was somebody that she thought was likely going to get locked up along with Samuel Green. So she came in 1857 to help save her parents. She came back to the Eastern Shore of Maryland. She came back to this whole area that was, filled with marshlands and wetlands. And at this time, by the time she came, her father was free. And at this time, her mother was also free. She was never set free by the man who was supposed to say, who inherited her. He was the man who ended up dying, who owned Harriet Tubman as well, and sold some of her family members. He ended up dying. He was the person that she actually prayed for, that he would die. He ended up dying. He died in debt. And because of the will of the original person person who owned Harriet Tubman's mother, because that was contested in court by his family, he couldn't sell the rest of Harriet Green's children. He couldn't sell the brothers and those. It was kind of a stay, if you will, put on his estate. And so you end up having a situation where his wife was in debt, and Ben Ross, Harriet Tubman's father, ends up working to pay for his wife's freedom, to pay for Harriet Green's freedom. And you imagine being a man, married to a woman, you have 9 children together, you're older, and you got to work to buy your wife's freedom. And so by the time Harriet Tubman comes back to try to save her dad, or what she thinks she needs to save her dad, he had purchased his wife's freedom, and her mother was free as well. So you have a situation where, the two of them are older. I mean, they were born in the 1700s, and they are older by this time. And Harriet Tubman has to make together a makeshift wagon because her parents can't run up and down the Choptank River. They can't hide in and out of the marshes at this time. They were kind of older. So she had to put together a makeshift wagon to help them carry them from the parts of the Eastern Shore up through Delaware until they can get to the point where they can get on trains or better transportation. She was a remarkable person, yet her father, Ben Ross, and her mother, Rick Green, were also remarkable. They were people who themselves were fighting against slavery. They were people who themselves were just trying to keep their family together. And there's a kind of a famous story that when Harriet Tubman came to save her brothers around Christmas, she had sent a message. And she had sent a letter, and she had told the people in the letter, she pretended like the letter was coming from the person's son. And she told them, tell the old folks that, I'll be coming and to ever be ready, and tell them that the good ship Zion is coming. And so when she sent this letter, it was coded. The authorities caught it. They didn't know who it was from, but they were suspicious of it. And the man who received it said he didn't understand what it was. It must have been something that was a mistake, but he actually knew what it was. And so he ends up getting a message to Harriet Tubman's brothers that, hey, Harriet's coming, and she's probably going to come on Christmas. You need to meet at your dad's house and at their mother and father's home. And at this point they were free. The mother and father's home, there was, a fodder house, a house where they kept supplies and resources and fodder, and her brothers were there. And she ended up having one of the people get the attention of her father. And her father came out of the house, and he knew immediately what was going on. He understood what Harriet was doing. He knew that Harriet Tubman was coming back and forth to save people. He was supporting his daughter. This is the kind of man he was. Ben Ross was the kind of man who was supporting his daughter and making sure she was able to get done what she needed to get done. And he knew exactly what was happening. He knew she was going to take her brothers north to freedom. And so he went back in the house, and they were supposed to come anyway to visit. The mom, Rick Green, knew that they were going to come to visit, but she didn't know that they were going to be taken to freedom. And she was kind of worried, like where they were. He gets food. He takes some clothing, whatever supplies he could have, because they didn't have anything. They had nothing to, but the clothes on their back, probably not even shoes. He took whatever he could, and he went to the house, the place where they were hiding out on his farm, and he covered his eyes with a handkerchief, and he just shoved the stuff inside. And he said, he covered his eyes, and when they opened the door and they were ready to leave, Harriet Tubman walked with her father, kind of hand in hand. And they walked for as far as they could until they had to stop. And he just listened to them go. And he kept his eyes covered with a handkerchief. And he said, why are you covering your eyes? He said, because when the authorities asked me, have I seen you and seen my sons, I'm going to be able to say, truly, I have not seen you. And but I know where you're going. And so that's the kind of man he was. He was like, I'm not going to look, and I'm going to be honest. I'm going to say I haven't seen you as I hear you walk away. And he may not have known. He probably did not know at that point whether he'd ever see them again. He may not have known that Harriet Tubman was going to come back a short time later and take him and his wife and bring them to Canada and then eventually to New York, where they settled and lived with her for a period of time. But that's the kind of man he was. And although we don't have all the specifics about her dad and what he was, but that story of them kind of walking hand in hand, arm in arm, as he covers his eyes with a handkerchief, and they kind of walk off to freedom, and they have to separate as she's taking them, farther and farther, gives you an idea of the kind of people that Harriet Tubman was associated with. It gives you an idea of the kind of strength that he had to have, and people like Samuel Green and other people in her family, or who just may have been friends, who may have been part of her network. And so I want to remember Rick Green and Ben Ross today. I want to remember Ben and Rick, because these were men and women at a time who were people who were standing up for real freedom. We think about the Revolutionary War, and I think about when they were born. They were born not that far after the Revolutionary War. Her parents were born not that long after the Revolutionary War, but they were real heroes. They were real revolutionaries. They really stand up for freedom. They really stood up for freedom. So I just want to remember today, and I want to take a look at the comments. Do you have any comments or questions or things you want to know more about, or things I can elaborate on? God bless you, Poet Williams. I very much appreciate that. That is, I just want to say thank you. So very much appreciate that. I appreciate the support, because this helps me continue to do it. So very much appreciate it. So I'm just going to say thank you for that. So for the donation and the gift, I very much appreciate that. So thank you. So I am just going to say thank you, Poet Williams. I very much appreciate that. That helps me move on. So I appreciate you doing that. You know, as we put this out, there's a lot of stuff that's happening now. And obviously, you know, stuff is happening tomorrow with the inauguration and things like that. And there are a lot of people who don't want to watch it and who don't want to see it. And there are a lot of people who are concerned about whether or not we're going to have books in our schools and whether or not we're going to be able to teach. Let's teach history right here. You know, I beg you, put your comments down below. There's so many people who know so many things. You guys have such a rich knowledge. Let's share this. Let's get this information out. I'm going to come out as much as I can. I want to make as many resources available as I can to talk about, because when I think about Ben Ross and Harriet Green, I think about Harriet Tubman's mother and father. I'm thinking about people who we should remember. When I think about Anna Murray, Frederick Douglass's first wife, or I think about Charles Langston Hughes' grandfather, or just people whose names we never know, like Ben and Rit Ross, Harriet Tubman's mother and father. These are people whose struggles we should remember. And it doesn't matter what people want to say about them. It's up to us. It's up to the living to remember them. These are remarkable people who raised their children the best they could. And probably, if any of us have slavery, as many of us do, and I do have slavery, and unfortunately in our heritage and in our history, we have some people like Ben and Rit. We have somebody like Ben Ross and Rick Green who fought to stay alive, because obviously, if they didn't live, we wouldn't. If they didn't fight to stay, they had a choice. You know, many of them could have maybe gone or committed suicide, or you know, some people didn't leave because they wanted to help the people who were there. Like Nat Turner, he came back. He wanted to help the people. There were some people who stayed in order to help their family, in order to be able to be with their family, in order to be with their children as best they can, and then maybe got stuck. There are all kinds of people who did heroic things with respect to slavery and fighting against that horrific thing that I want to remember. And I want to remember Ben and Rit Ross Day. Thank you so much for joining me. God bless you. And thank you very much. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much.